We've mentioned the Cappadocians before. They were very influential in the development of monasticism in the eastern part of the empire. Right? It seems like it starts there, and it'll be the early Middle Ages when it becomes more popular in the West. Basil of Caesarea, for example, encouraged by his sister Macrina, had developed a monastic rule, the guidelines for the community that even today still shape monasticism among Greeks. The goal of the Cappadocian rule was to try and avoid the extremes, like you see in some of those anchorite communities. But there was still that emphasis on the obedience of individuals to their superiors. Communal monasticism, in their eyes, allowed monks to love God and neighbor. I mean, if you're off by yourself, you can love God, but how do you love your neighbor? Because you have no neighbor. But the communal monks, okay, you can love your neighbor. It's also safer and more practical to live with other people than live by yourself in the desert. Children were encouraged, but a lot of the people tended to be single. But that doesn't mean that married people and slaves weren't accepted. They were often accepted as well. The focus of the Cappadocian rule, or the rule of Basil, was the providing of services by monks to the needy. And so it wasn't just about this focus on yourself and your spiritual pursuits, but you then also ministered to others. And so trying to connect it to the larger mission of the church and not keep it something separate. During this time, there were also very prominent women monastics. And so it wasn't just a male thing. And in fact, of course, we talked about how Macrina, the sister of Basil of Caesarea, and Gregory of Nyssa, was actually the one who had encouraged Basil to look towards monasticism. So it's kind of a place for women to have a role in the church. And in fact, she had kind of started a monastic retreat on her family's holdings before Basil had started his community. And so she's the one that emphasizes renunciation, contemplation, and then her brothers pick up on this as well. Two other prominent women monastics during this time were a woman named Paula and another woman named Eustochium. They were companions of Jerome, who had created the Vulgate. And they started monastic houses in Bethlehem when Jerome had moved to Palestine. In the West, women like Marcella and Melania encouraged the monastic ideal. Marcella was a widow who had started a community that included Paula and Eustochium until Jerome came, and then they kind of helped Jerome with some of his work. And the focus of that community was on a deep study of Scripture. This was something that Marcella was particularly interested in. Melania was from a rich aristocratic family, but at the age of 22 had decided to become a monastic. She was a staunch defender of the Nicene theology, orthodoxy, and followed monks to Palestine, and actually started a double monastery, one for men, one for women, on the Mount of Olives.
All of these names sound very still based very much in what was the Roman Empire.
I mean, you still find a lot of monastic houses throughout Europe, a lot less than through the Middle Ages. Right? It's not something that a lot of people aspire to. But you can even find monastic houses here in the United States. But yeah, certainly, there's.
Right now, this is still kind of focused on the Italy.
Yeah, we're talking in these three, Basil, Macrina, four, Paula and Eustochium, they're in the east. Right? So there are places like Caesarea, there are places like Palestine, and Marcella and Melania are the ones that are kind of on the forefront of it in the West. And it's not until the Middle Ages where it really picks up in Italy, Spain, some places like that. Just like he did when he was talking about martyrdom, Ferguson in the textbook points out that there are certain motifs that develop in talking about monastic life, things that people emphasize, or ways that they talk about what monks were doing. And so one popular image was that of military life. Now, the Greek philosophers had also been talked about in military terms. Paul, of course, talks about putting on the armor of God. He tells Timothy about soldiers. Kind of relates that to a preacher's lifestyle. Right? The soldiers are supported, and then, of course, there are ways in which this is incorporated into the monastic life as part of the spiritual struggle against evil. Right? And so these military metaphors that are used to describe it. There are also ways in which monastics are compared very positively with the martyrs. They're often also compared to the confessors, right? These individuals who, because of society, have been separated. They're out there fighting against the secularized church. Now, often, of course, this is the monastics looking at their own life versus the church looking at the monastics. The literature of monasticism often features struggles against demons, internal and external. All right? So the literature and the motifs of monasticism are often very demonic. And so Anthony, for example, talks about fighting, or the stories about Anthony talk about him fighting demons, both external and internal. On the other hand, though, there is something angelic about being a monastic. That although you're facing demons, you are sustained by grace. And there's something angelic about these individuals who are renouncing society and going off out into the desert or the wilderness. There's also a way in which monasticism is very Gnostic, but in a positive way. That they experientially know God, versus the Gnostics who were looking for this secret knowledge. The monastics are those who are, because of their separation, coming closer to God, knowing God more deeply. The monastic life is also much like the life of the philosopher. Now, certainly a lot of philosophers didn't go off in the desert like monastics might, but the idea of people going to these monastics to seek guidance was very similar to what they had done with the philosophers. People looking to these individuals for guidance, how to live life. The monastic life was a life of new birth. And so there's baptismal imagery that's used in describing the monastic life as well. But it's also eschatological. It's recovering paradise in the caves of the monastic life. Personally, to me, that doesn't sound like paradise, but there's like this idea that they're recovering what God had originally intended. Let's turn from monasticism and talk about some other developments in Christianity at this time. One has to do with the places where Christians worship. Up until the 3rd century, of course, there was a lot of meeting in houses, but as we talked about in the 3rd century, we saw the existence of church buildings like dirty roads. And so there probably were quite a few church buildings at various times throughout the 3rd century, but most appear to have been destroyed during the persecution of Diocletian in the 4th. So most Christians in the 4th century returned to house churches. After the peace of Constantine, however, a lot of people start going back or flock to become members of the church, and so new spaces were needed to contain them. In centers where the empire held sway, the church buildings often became very grandiose and luxurious. But there were essentially two styles of church buildings that began to develop. The first is the basilica. Now, the basilica was essentially a common public building in Roman culture. It's not like it was invented by Christians. It was how most public buildings were. It was a rectangular room divided into usually about three sections known as naves. And then there were often columns running down the center, of course, to support the roof. The end opposite the entrance, so the entrance would be at this end, and the opposite end was often referred to as the niche or the apse. This was the place where, for example, the bishop would sit in his bishop's chair. The table for communion would be down there, of course, towards the front. Often the basilicas had tiered roofs and windows on the upper and lower levels to allow light in. So essentially taking a public building and just converting it to a church building. Another style of church building was known as the convergent martyrium. It was often a circular or octagonal building that had domes as part of its structure. Usually there were two parts to the building with a row of columns that separated them. So the center and then an aisle that ran around the walls. I couldn't find a good diagram to kind of give you an idea of what that looked like. Some church buildings were constructed to face the east. Even though there doesn't appear anything within the New Testament to suggest that that should be done, a lot of people felt that the east was the direction to pray. It might also be a carryover from this kind of assimilation that some converted pagans are doing between the sun god and Christ, and so facing east. Others did face west, so it wasn't like all church buildings did that. Usually there was a communion table, which was being, by this time, as I said already, referred to as an altar, often in the center or in the apse. The communion tables started out as wood, but gradually people will move to using stone for those tables. There are often also chairs in the apse where the bishop sat. The chair, the cathedra in Latin, from which we get our term cathedral, and so you have these buildings known as cathedrals that house the chair of the bishop. We'll see that more in the Middle Ages. So the chair for the bishop, benches for the presbyters. Everyone else, though, had to stand. And it wasn't like in chapel where you might be standing for 5 minutes, maybe 7 at the most. Some of these sermons went on for hours. And so you're not the one that gets to stand or gets to sit. Often church buildings also had other structures attached to them. Houses for the priest or maybe the bishop, a hostel, right? So a place where travelers could stay, maybe a bath or a baptistry. By the end of the 4th century, however, Christians often just converted pagan temples, often with very little modification. Right? So they're kind of taking over these buildings and kind of making them into church buildings. Another aspect of the institutionalizing that's taking place in the 4th century is developments related to the liturgy. The liturgy refers to the style and pattern of worship, what is done, when it is done, how it's done. For the first 3 centuries, a lot of that worship was done rather informally. There was a divided service, the service of the Word, right, the teaching, and then the service of the Eucharist. And so the catechumens were dismissed. Anyone that wasn't baptized was dismissed. By the 4th century, however, there was a formalized structure that developed. Now, often that formalized structure varied from place to place. So you're not seeing one formalized structure across the empire, but the idea of there are formalized structures. And gradually, certain structures, certain liturgies will become more popular. These would involve prayers, certain prayers being said, singing of psalms, verse-by-verse expositions of Scripture. Gradually, the preaching became more rhetorically influenced, and so it was less about the content, or not the content decreased, but the artistry or the style of the sermon began to be emphasized as well. Additionally, there are a few descriptions by Basil, by John Chrysostom, by Ambrose, and others that would include specific prayers that are to be offered, scriptural references that are to be read, songs that are to be sung, etc. And these are, in previous generations, it has been books like that, like the Didache, for example, the Apostolic Traditions. These were examples to be followed. But more and more it becomes, these are to be said exactly. And throughout the 4th century into the Middle Ages, there is more and more pressure for uniformity among churches. And so while you find several different liturgies in the 4th century, there's more and more pressure that everyone adopt the same style of liturgy.